Right, so for those of you who don't know me, I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London, and I'm also the Academic Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established, of course, in memory of the late British historian. And as many of you will no doubt know, Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, in addition to having authored many dozens of books on a wide range of topics, including the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, the 20th century, and so on. One of Sir Martin's greatest gifts really was to bring history alive to his audiences, to make it accessible and exciting. So fittingly, the centre's aim is to bring the finest historical research to a broad non-academic public and to perpetuate Sir Martin's legacy to make history accessible and engaging to that audience. So after I finish my introduction, I'll put a link into the chat. We offer a wide program of events across the year on the subjects that Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So please, if you're not already on our mailing list, do join our mailing list so that we can let you know about forthcoming events. Before I introduce Lee, I would also just make a small plea and say that as a charity, we rely on donations so that we can keep our events free at the point of access and reach that wide audience. So any contributions you would like to make are very gratefully received, and it's very easy to donate on our website. So welcome Lee Pollock once again. Lee is a historian, writer, and public speaker on the life and times of Winston Churchill. He's written about Churchill in many prominent public forums, including the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, American Purpose, and the Daily Beast. And he's appeared on CBS, the BBC, and many other media outlets in both the US and in Britain. He's also spoken at lots of high-profile venues, including the US House of Representatives, the Pentagon, and the US Supreme Court, as well as leading universities, history museums, and so on. So we're very privileged and happy to have Lee with us again today. Lee is a director, advisor to the board, and member of the operating committee of the International Churchill Society. And he also previously served as the Society's executive director. And he tells me he is a proud Canadian. He's a graduate of McGill University and also holds a degree from the University of Chicago. So Lee will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And after that, we'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. If you would like to send comments, you can do so in the chat to me, and I will put them to Lee after the talk is finished. And his talk tonight is called Churchill and the Royals. So with that, over to you, Lee.
That better?
Yep, now we hear you.
And let me share my screen. And there we go. Perfect. Well, Shirley, thank you for that very nice introduction. And I share your belief that the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center is a wonderful living memorial to Martin Gilbert, one of the great historians of our time. I think we need Martin's wisdom ever more than ever today. His belief in the importance of true history and making it relevant to contemporary concerns is something that is needed more than ever. I'm a donor to the Martin Gilbert Learning Center, and I certainly hope that everyone who's watching tonight who enjoys this program will do likewise. And if you want to learn more about Winston Churchill, our website, winstonchurchill.org, is an absolute cornucopia of information about him. And if you want to join the Churchill Society, we'd welcome your involvement. So, and now, ladies and gentlemen, put on your crowns and coronets, take up your orbs and scepters, and join me as we explore the fascinating story of Winston Churchill and the royal family. I want to start not at the beginning of Winston Churchill's long, eventful life, but towards its end, when Churchill was in his 81st year. He had served as Britain's iconic leader during the Second World War, despite which his countrymen resoundingly voted him out of office in July 1945 as the conflict was coming to a close. Notwithstanding that rebuff and the fact that he was already 70, Winston Churchill was determined to return to power. He remained a member of Parliament and leader of the Conservative Party. And in the October 1951 election, the Tories eked out a narrow majority in the House of Commons, and Churchill was once again Prime Minister. Winston Churchill's second term as Prime Minister lasted 3.5 years and paled in comparison to the glorious days of the Second World War. He suffered a serious stroke in 1953, and the Conservative Party leadership impatiently pushed him to step down. Churchill finally faced the reality of his advancing age and declining powers, and his retirement was set for April 5th, 1955. The evening before, an unusual event took place at number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's official residence. At this, which was Churchill's farewell dinner, the guests included Clement Attlee, as well as the widow of Neville Chamberlain, who Churchill had succeeded in office in the dark days of May 1940. But what made the evening unique was that the Queen herself came to number 10. Hold on a second. Let's see, my screen's not advancing for some reason. There we go. Sorry about that. The Queen herself came to number 10 in an unprecedented event, recognizing Churchill's place in British and world history. Churchill toasted the young Queen less than 2 years past her coronation with romantic and sentimental flourish, saying, quote, "Never have the august duties which fall upon the British monarchy been discharged with more devotion than in the brilliant opening of your Majesty's reign." Neither the 80-year-old Churchill nor the 28-year-old Queen could have imagined that she would sit on the throne today, an incredible 67 years later. Churchill went to Buckingham Palace the following day to submit his resignation. But one problem remained unsettled: how to honor his retirement. His private secretary, Jock Colville, suggested to the palace that Churchill be offered a dukedom. That would be remarkable, as no non-royal dukedoms had been created since 1874, the year of Churchill's own birth, and the royal family was firm in the belief that no others ever should be. Faced with this dilemma, Colville assured the Queen that if she would make the offer, it would be declined. He raised the matter with Churchill, who said he would reject it. What, he wondered, would he be Duke of? Duke of London was one of the possibilities. But Churchill reiterated he wished to die in the House of Commons as plain Winston Churchill. But Jock Colville suddenly had second thoughts about this clever scheme. He wrote in his diary, quote, "I was greatly disturbed as I saw the Prime Minister going off to the palace in his frock coat and top hat, knowing as I did that he was madly in love with the Queen. I was alarmed that sentimental feelings might indeed make him accept at the last moment." When Churchill returned from the audience, the first thing Colville asked was, "How did it go?" And Churchill replied, "Do you know, the most remarkable thing, she offered me a dukedom." With trepidation, Colville asked, "What did you say?" fearing he was about to get the wrong answer. Churchill replied, "Well, you know, I very nearly accepted. I was so moved by her beauty and her charm and the kindness with which she made the offer. For a moment, I thought of accepting." But Churchill fortunately continued, "But finally, I remembered I must die, as I always have been, Winston Churchill. I asked her to forgive me for not accepting it. And do you know, it's an odd thing, she seemed almost relieved." Thus came the official end of Winston Churchill's relationship with the kings and queens of Britain, which had begun in the reign of Elizabeth's great-great-grandmother 8 decades before. Those decades were among the most significant in history. Think of revolutions, world wars, communism, fascism, the Holocaust, and the birth of the atomic age. Winston Churchill and the royal family had central roles in many of those events. So let's now turn to that story. Winston Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at a place that many of you know and probably have visited, Blenheim Palace. This is, of course, the ancestral home of one of Britain's greatest and most aristocratic families, the Dukes of Marlborough. Churchill's grandfather was the 7th Duke, and his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a rising politician. The Marlborough dynasty stretched back to the 1st Duke, John Churchill, who had led a coalition of nations that defeated the continental aggressor of their day, King Louis XIV of France, at the Battle of Blenheim in Bavaria in 1704. The reigning monarch then, Queen Anne, and a grateful nation commemorated the victory by an enormous grant to John Churchill to build a home fit for a hero. The Britain of Queen Victoria, in which Winston Churchill was born, stood at the center of what he later called, quote, a settled world order, where the nation's military, political, and economic power was unrivaled. It was a hierarchical world, which the great Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli described as, quote, for the few and the very few. The Queen was in the middle of what would be a 63-year reign, and Britain's colonial expansion had turned the map of the world red on every continent. Less than 2 years later, Disraeli arranged for her to become Empress of India, and the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, literally came true. Politics, society, and government were largely dominated by the monarchy, aristocracy, and gentry, and by the pageantry and spectacle which enveloped them. This was Winston Churchill's world, where, in the words of one of his later colleagues, quote, a benign upper class dispensed benefits to an industrious and grateful working class. The monarchy was at the apex and the workers were at the bottom. And despite Winston Churchill's natural comfort with this hierarchy, his relationship with the monarchy as an institution and the royal family as individuals was more complex and sometimes more strained than the glittering spectacle of his retirement dinner at number 10 would suggest. As his political stances and his party allegiances shifted over his long career, there were times when he and the crown were on the opposite sides of important issues. Churchill could find individual sovereigns difficult to deal with, obtuse and ignorant. The disparaging opinions about them he expressed in private were reciprocated, especially early in his career, when many royals shared the belief that Winston Churchill was brash, egotistical, ambitious, and unreliable, a grasping politician lacking in judgment. Churchill's view of the monarchy was deeply rooted in his sense of British history. As a schoolboy, he read the classics of English liberal history and later echoed many of those themes in his highly popular 4-volume History of the English-Speaking Peoples. In Churchill's mind, Britain had been blessed with many great monarchs who were outstanding leaders in war and skilled administrators in peace. Those ranged from William the Conqueror to Henry V and Queen Elizabeth I, who saved England from the Spanish Armada. But there were others, King John of Magna Carta fame, James II, who was chased out of the country because of his Catholicism, and most notoriously, George III, whose failing was to lose the American colonies. As many of you know, that king's reputation has recently been buffered by our good friend Andrew Roberts in his wonderful new biography, King George III. To Winston Churchill, despite the shortcomings of individual monarchs, the crown was a sacred institution which connected the past, present, and future, and exemplified the unity and identity of the nation. Churchill also noted that other European nations frequently suffered under despotic and absolute rulers, compared with the more limited constitutional monarchy that had evolved in Britain. The result in his mind was a happy compromise where the sovereign reigned, but Parliament legislated and the politicians governed. Churchill had no doubt that Victoria was one of the greatest monarchs. In his words, quote, "A constitutional sovereign who represented staunchness and continuity in British traditions and set a new standard for the conduct of the monarchy." The happy home life that Victoria enjoyed with her husband, Prince Albert, and their children was a model of decency. And thanks to Disraeli, the Queen was not only the head of the British nation, but also presided over a great imperial monarchy envied, admired, and feared by so many other nations. In Churchill's view, the monarchy could do all this because it was, quote, "above the ebb and flow of party strife, the rise and fall of ministries, and changes in public opinion." But with all that, he told his wife Clementine, shortly after their marriage, quote, "The royal prerogatives are always exercised on the advice of ministers." More bluntly, he later told the exiled Duke of Windsor, who had abdicated the throne, quote, "When our kings are in conflict with our constitution, we change our kings." But what did this mean in practice, and what relationship did Churchill have with successive monarchs? Let's start with the first two of the 6 sovereigns of Churchill's lifetime: Victoria herself and her son, who was Prince of Wales for almost 60 years, and then king in his own right as Edward VII. Victoria was a contemporary of Churchill's grandfather, and her son, the Prince of Wales, of Churchill's father, Lord Randolph. While Churchill never met the Queen, there was certainly a connection, even a friendship, between the great ducal houses such as the Marlboroughs and the royal family. At various times, Lord Randolph was close to the Prince of Wales, and the prince's relationship with Winston's beautiful American mother, Jenny Jerome, was said to be even closer, leading to rumors that she was one of the prince's many romantic liaisons. The great Queen finally died on January 22nd, 1901, having reigned longer than any previous British sovereign. Churchill later noted in his history of the English-speaking peoples, quote, "The Victorian era closed in 1901, but the sense of purpose and confidence which it inspired lived through the ordeals to come in the new century." And more candidly, he wrote to his mother, quote, "What a long way this name seems to take one back." Churchill was referring to the previous Edward, Edward VI, who reigned as a boy king 300 years before. Churchill continued, "I am glad he," referring to the new king, "has got his innings at last, and I'm most interested to watch how he plays them." That's Edward as the Prince of Wales and as the king. And even before the new king's accession, Churchill had been cultivating a relationship with him. The prince in turn advised him, wisely as it turned out, quote, "Parliamentary and literary life will suit you better than the monotony of military life in India." In September 1902, only a year after he had first become a member of Parliament and was still just 27, Churchill was honored by an invitation to visit the King and Queen at their private residence, Balmoral in Scotland. Churchill reported to his mother, quote, "I have been very kindly treated here by the King, who has gone out of his way to be nice to me. It has been most pleasant and easy." And this is Churchill as a young MP. A few years later, in early 1907, Churchill visited the King and Queen while they were all on holiday in France. The King wrote him a warm-hearted letter, which read in part, quote, "I am very glad to have the opportunity of having conversations with you on various interesting subjects. We have known your parents for many years, even before their marriage, and you and your brother since your childhood. The king continued, knowing the great abilities you possess, I am watching your political career with great interest. But as Winston Churchill rose to prominence and the liberal government in which he served became increasingly radical, his drive, brashness, ambition, and his apparent opportunism began to grate on the monarch. By 1909, the king was describing Churchill as, quote, almost more of a cad in office than he was in opposition. And when Churchill, sounding very radical, attacked dukes, despite being the grandson of one, as, quote, ornamental creatures who are part of a miserable minority of titled persons who represent nobody, unquote, the king's private secretary, Lord Knowles, took the extraordinary step of writing to the Times newspaper to protest. Churchill took it in stride, himself writing, quote, Knowles and the king must really have gone mad. I shall take no notice of it. But despite these frictions, when the king died in May 1910, Churchill wrote the letter of condolence on behalf of the House of Commons and was enlisted by the new king, George V, to prepare his message of appreciation to Parliament. The king's words about his predecessor undoubtedly reflected Churchill's own thoughts. He wrote, King Edward's care for the country and his people, his skilled and prudent guidance of affairs, and his devotion to public duty will be held in honor at home and beyond the seas. Nevertheless, Churchill's relationship with the new 44-year-old King George V got off to a rocky start. George recognized Churchill's energy and intelligence, but shared his father's view that Winston was, quote, irresponsible and unreliable. When Churchill moved from Home Secretary to First Lord of the Admiralty the next year, things did not immediately improve. That's Churchill as First Lord and a beautiful photograph of the King and Queen at their coronation. Winston Churchill at this time was a zealous reformer, and the new king was a former naval officer, head of all the armed forces, and a staunch believer in tradition and precedent. When Churchill asked the king to name a new battleship, HMS Cromwell, the king took vehement exception. It was perhaps understandable that he would not want one of his ships being named after the man who had chopped off the head of his ancestor, King Charles I. Churchill made no secret of his view that the king was a dim reactionary, and the king, in turn, thought Churchill rude and inconsiderate. After another blow-up about naval policy in 1912, Churchill told his wife, Clementine, quote, the king talked more stupidly about the Navy than I have ever heard him before. Really, it is disheartening to hear this cheap and silly drivel with which he lets himself be filled up. The court and the crown were thus quite unsympathetic to Churchill by the time the First World War began in August 1914. When Churchill's political career imploded the following year, after he was blamed for the failure of the Dardanelles campaign and lost his position in the cabinet, the news was greeted with barely concealed relief at Buckingham Palace. Queen Alexandra told her son, the new Prince of Wales, it is all that stupid, young, foolhardy Winston Churchill's fault. The catastrophe of the First World War profoundly affected Winston Churchill, and his attitude to the monarchy thus became more appreciative and admiring. The war left Churchill disturbed and uncertain as he looked upon a social and political landscape that bore little resemblance to the Edwardian Belle Epoque, with its settled values, historic institutions, venerable titles, and great estates. The great ruling houses of Europe had been smashed, and as the 1920s and 30s progressed, the continent lapsed into anarchy, civil war, revolution, and dictatorship, both fascist and communist. In Britain, aristocratic families stood on shaky ground, and the direction of the new universal democracy seemed uncertain. These changes and Churchill's maturing age, he turned 50 in 1924, helped to explain the resulting transformation in his relationship with the king and his family. He no longer regarded George as the ignorant, blimpish reactionary of pre-war days, but now instead as the embodiment of decency, tradition, and duty in a world of strife, anarchy, and revolution. And the king, in turn, now warmed to Churchill as an old family friend and increasingly staunch conservative. The relationship with the king continued as Churchill served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second highest position in the government after Prime Minister, from 1924 to 1929. When he was once again invited to Balmoral in 1927, in September, he told Clementine, quote, "After a particularly pleasant luncheon, the king and I had a good talk about all sorts of things." He returned for another visit the following year as the only non-royal in attendance. Of the king's 2-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, Churchill presciently wrote, "She is a character. She has the air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant." At this point, few people would have guessed that Elizabeth's father, Prince Albert, the king's younger son, would inherit the throne in unprecedented circumstances, and that she, in turn, would become Britain's longest reigning monarch. And when the king celebrated his silver jubilee in 1935, Churchill wrote a series of 7 articles for the Evening Standard newspaper. His words were heartfelt, transcending all the drama and upheaval of the days. Churchill said, quote, "The king's reign has seen social, political, and scientific changes so decisive that we cannot even attempt to measure them. But here, at the center of the British Empire, in the freest society yet achieved in human record, a king who has done his duty will be acclaimed by the cheers of his faithful people." When the king died the following year, Churchill's obituary reached even higher. He wrote, "In the course of his reign, empires and monarchies had fallen, dictatorship and anarchy had flourished, democracy had become incontinent and unfettered. But unshaken and unweakened, though all be drifting, our monarchy stands firm." Churchill concluded, "This was an achievement that could not be separated from the personality of a good, wise, and truly noble king." Churchill continued, "He revived the national spirit, and in so doing, won the affection of his subjects and the admiration of mankind." Churchill's next sovereign, Edward VIII, was to be a different matter. He was 41 and unmarried, the first to ascend the throne without a spouse since Victoria, age 18, a century before. But this new king was compromised by a history of long relationships with other men's wives and a wide circle of acquaintances who his traditional hidebound father never would have countenanced. This was to be a different and ultimately disastrous reign. Churchill had known the new king as Prince of Wales for many years. He had participated when Home Secretary in what he called, quote, "a beautiful and moving ceremony at Carnarvon Castle in 1911, when the prince was invested with that title on his 16th birthday. After initially sharing his father's doubts, the prince in turn came to believe Churchill was, quote, "a wonderful man with great powers of work." And while this king is now remembered for his abdication and for the wandering and purposeless life that he and Wallace Simpson led for the subsequent 3 decades, it should be remembered that in the 1920s, this young prince was idolized in Britain, America, and around the world. He was handsome, glamorous, and a breath of fresh air in the stuffy institutions of the British monarchy. Prince Edward's royal rank, his world travels, good looks, and bachelor status gathered much public attention. At the height of his popularity, he was the most photographed celebrity in the world, and his modern style of dress was widely imitated, the Windsor knot being just one example. There was even a very popular song entitled, "I Danced with a Man Who Danced with the Prince of Wales." More importantly, he visited poverty-stricken areas of Britain where his sympathy for the plight of the unemployed was widely saluted. His travels, both official and private, provoked media frenzies that would be the equal of the paparazzi and tabloid press today. I can imagine that Oprah would surely have wanted to interview him. And during the 1920s, Churchill helped the prince with speechwriting and delivery, sent him copies of his books, and corresponded with him about public affairs. They even played polo together. And when Edward became king in January 1936, Churchill sent him a grandiloquent, if not fawning letter saying, quote, "I offer my heartfelt wishes that a reign which has been so nobly begun may be blessed with peace and glory." Churchill added, quote, "Your Majesty's name will shine in history as the bravest and best beloved of the sovereigns who have worn the island crown." Winston Churchill was prescient about many things, but that quality deserted him in this case, and his prediction was totally wrong. Churchill's hopes for the new king may have been sincere and heartfelt, but they rested on a naive and exaggerated sense of his virtues, accompanied by a blind eye to his increasingly glaring faults. As the king's relationship with Wallis Simpson continued to grow, and it slowly dawned on the government of conservative prime minister that the king was determined to marry her, a constitutional and political crisis came to a head. The prediction made by the king's father, George V, a few years before, was about to come true. He said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." Well, Churchill realized that a formal marriage between the king and Mrs. Simpson would be impossible. He begged that the monarch be given more time to consider, and perhaps that a morganatic marriage, under which Wallis would be his wife but not queen, could be arranged. Churchill's vain hope was that with enough time, the king would give up his infatuation with this married woman as he had with several others. Churchill persevered, allying himself with the conniving press baron Lord Beaverbrook in support of the king. He sympathized with the king's desire to have a happy home life to accompany his public responsibilities. But Churchill found himself out of step with the government, the church, and most of the nation. One of Churchill's friends scolded him at the time, quote, "How can you suggest that the present state of affairs should be prolonged for months? It ought to be settled at once." All this boiled over in a heated debate in the House of Commons on December 7th, 1936. When Churchill pleaded for more time for the king, he was viciously shouted down, and the speaker ruled him out of order. Churchill stormed out of the chamber. Historian Sir David Candidacy aptly describes the outcome, quote, "In championing the king, Churchill did his own reputation untold harm with the public, other politicians, and the court. His plea for extra time for the king was patently unrealistic, and he failed to appreciate that Edward had already decided to give up the throne." Sir David concludes, quote, "Churchill seriously misjudged the character of the sovereign and the mood of the country." This was a setback that Winston Churchill could ill afford at a time when his energy was needed to warn Britain and the world of the dangers of appeasing Nazi Germany. 3 days after the parliamentary debate, the king abdicated, and Churchill helped to write his farewell broadcast, in which the king movingly said, "You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Sir Alan Lascelles, the king's private secretary, and the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had observed what Churchill did not. The king, unlike his father, was not devoted to duty and was dangerously careless with state documents. Through their daily contact with him, they understood early that the king would not give up Mrs. Simpson and that the nation would be better off with a change in monarchs, and a quick one at that. But soon, while Churchill lauded Edward in the House of Commons after the abdication, he recognized that the monarchy would carry on and that the throne and a new king had to be supported. The new king was Edward's younger brother, Prince Albert, Duke of York, who styled himself in tribute to their father as George VI. Unlike his brother, Bertie, as he was known to his family, had been happily married since 1923. At the coronation of the new king in May 1937, Churchill, noting the dignity which he brought to the ceremony, turned to Clementine and said, quote, "You were right. I now see the other one," meaning the former king, "wouldn't have done." But Churchill was not in high standing with the new monarchs and their court. George and Elizabeth thoroughly detested Wallis Simpson and blamed her for the disruption in their previously tranquil life that the abdication had created. They and the king's widowed mother, Queen Mary, regarded anyone who supported the Duke of Windsor and Wallis, even indirectly, as suspect. Churchill's relationship with the king and queen was also complicated by the fact that they were devoted supporters of their new prime minister, Neville Chamberlain, who succeeded Baldwin just 2 weeks after their coronation. They shared Chamberlain's strong sense of moral values and his belief that appeasement of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany was the only alternative to a catastrophic repetition of the horrors of the First World War only 20 years before. So it was in January 1939, still suspicious of Churchill, that the king told Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King, quote, "I would never wish to appoint Churchill to any office unless it were absolutely necessary in time of war." And when Chamberlain finally resigned in May 1940, and the king was obliged at Chamberlain's request to send for Churchill to replace him, the king told the departing prime minister, quote, "You have been grossly and unfairly treated, and I deeply regret your going." The king and much of the Tory party had strongly preferred as prime minister Lord Halifax to be Chamberlain's successor. He was decent, religious, landowning, and a fox hunter, and importantly, a personal friend of the king. The pressure on Winston Churchill as the new prime minister was immense, as France, which had fought bravely for 4 years in the First World War, now teetered on collapse in just 6 weeks. Relations between Churchill and the king were slow to warm, not helped by Churchill's constitutionally correct insistence that the king must accept any ministers Churchill wished to include in the new government. To the king's considerable frustration, these included the dreaded and loathsome, in the eyes of the king and many others, Lord Beaverbrook, who became Minister of Supply, and in their view, the equally disreputable Brendan Bracken, who was Churchill's young factotum hatchet man, as well as devoted follower. And with all the incredible demands on his time, Churchill was not always scrupulous in keeping the king informed and he was often infuriatingly unpunctual for royal audience or luncheons. The king at one point complained, quote, Winston says he will come at 6, puts it off until 6:30 by telephone, and then shows up at 7. Keeping the king waiting for more than an hour was not something that previous, more considerate prime ministers had done. Soon, Winston Churchill established himself as the personification of Britain's unity and resolve, and became the nation's supreme warlord and grand strategist as it faced Adolf Hitler alone. As Jock Colville, Chamberlain's former private secretary, now serving Churchill with enthusiasm and admiration, noted, quote, as the war progressed, the king and queen became as devoted to Winston as he consistently was to them. The king soon came to recognize, as did the nation, the vigor, brilliance, and sheer indispensability of his wartime prime minister. When Churchill sailed across the U-boat-infested Atlantic the following year to meet with President Franklin Roosevelt in the Atlantic Charter Conference, the king wrote to him, quote, I must confess that I shall breathe a sigh of relief when you are safely back at home again. The two began having private luncheons at Buckingham Palace every Tuesday, serving themselves from the sideboard so that no staff need be present. The king's diary recorded the wide variety of matters they discussed, with Churchill secure in the knowledge that the king could be trusted with every secret of the war, including vital ones such as the Enigma decrypts coming from Bletchley Park and the planning for D-Day itself. Upon hearing that Churchill was going up to the roof of the Air Ministry building to watch German bombers during the Blitz, the king appealed to him to desist, writing in his diary, quote, I cannot afford to lose him, nor can the country at this moment. As the king praised Churchill, the prime minister returned the compliment. He reminded the king that he had served the king's father and grandfather as a minister, and that his own father and grandfather had done so for Queen Victoria. Churchill added, quote, the war has drawn the throne and people more closely together than ever before, and the king and queen are more beloved by all classes than any of the princes of the past. Thus, they became as close as any prime minister and sovereign in history, and the relationship grew into a true and intimate friendship. Churchill was the only one of his 4 prime ministers the king addressed by his first name, calling him Winston. To Churchill, of course, the king was always Your Majesty. And when VE Day came at last in May 1945, Churchill's transformation in the eyes of the royal family was complete. He appeared with them on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to the adulation of hundreds of thousands celebrating below. Churchill moved an address of loyalty to the king in the House of Commons, noting, quote, we have the oldest, most famous, most honored, most secure, and most serviceable monarchy in the world. It is an ancient and glorious institution. And then shockingly, Churchill was turned out of office by a seemingly ungrateful nation just 2 months later, when the opposition Labour Party won a landslide victory in the general election in July. The king was as reluctant to lose his prime minister now as he had been to appoint him 5 years before. He wrote to Churchill saying, quote, I was shocked at the result, and I thought it was most ungrateful to you personally after all your hard work for the people. The king continued, I shall miss your counsel more than I could ever say. Churchill remained close to the royal family while serving as leader of the opposition, and the king was very pleased to welcome him back as prime minister in October 1951. When Churchill, just a few months later, was told of the king's death at age only 56, he burst into tears, telling his private secretary, quote, "Bad news, the worst." Churchill movingly eulogized the king in the House of Commons, saying, quote, "During these last months, the king walked with death as if death were a companion, an acquaintance whom he recognized and did not fear." Churchill added, "The king's conduct on the throne was a model and guide for constitutional sovereigns throughout the world." The 2-year-old princess who had so impressed Churchill in 1928 was now queen, and he saluted her by saying, quote, "I, whose youth was passed in the august, unchallenged, and tranquil glories of the Victorian era, may well feel a thrill in invoking once more the prayer and anthem, 'God save the Queen.'" The aging prime minister saw him playing the role of wise and venerable counselor to the new queen, as Lord Melbourne had done to the 18-year-old Queen Victoria back in 1837. Churchill wore a frock coat and top hat for their regular audiences, and they talked at length, not just about affairs of state, but about polo and horses, and Churchill's early life as a junior officer in India more than a half-century before. The Queen gave Churchill the highest decoration under her personal control, the Order of the Garter, finally making him Sir Winston. Elizabeth had not expected to succeed her father at such an early age, and during the 3 years in which Churchill served as her prime minister, her confidence in affairs of state and her role as queen and head of the Commonwealth steadily grew. When Churchill retired in 1955, she told him, quote, "It would be useless to pretend that any of your successors will ever, for me, be able to hold the place of my first prime minister, to whom I owe so much, and for whose wise guidance during the early years of my reign, I shall always be so profoundly grateful." No wonder that on Churchill's 80th birthday in 1954, the royal family bought him a personal gift of 4 elegant silver wine coasters. The Queen Mother wrote to him in congratulations, "You have been and are such an inspiration to our people, and we are all so very proud of you." Now out of office, old age and ill health eventually fell hard on Winston Churchill. The exercise of power had been the elixir that propelled him through his eventful life, and without that, he inevitably declined. Depressed by Britain's fall from the ranks of the world superpowers and the collapse of his empire, he told his private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, quote, "I worked very hard all my life, and I have achieved a great deal. In the end, to achieve nothing." It was, of course, untrue, and history would show otherwise, but it was sad that he would think it. The last act in the long drama of Winston Churchill and the royal family played out in January 1965. He suffered a massive stroke early in the month and lingered semi-conscious, finally dying on January 24th. Planning for Churchill's funeral had begun some years before with the code name Operation Hope Not. It was to be a grand spectacle watched around the world, with leaders from 120 countries in attendance, including 7 kings and queens and 1 emperor. A century before, Queen Victoria, responding to a petition from Parliament, had only reluctantly agreed to a state funeral for William Gladstone, perhaps the greatest prime minister of the 19th century, as Winston Churchill was of the 20th. But this time, the Queen immediately decreed that honor would be given to Sir Winston. She sent a personal message of condolences to Lady Churchill saying, quote, "The whole world is the poorer by the loss of his many-sided genius. The survival of this country in the face of the greatest danger that has ever threatened it will be a perpetual memorial to his leadership. Churchill's funeral was held on January 30th at St. Paul's Cathedral, attended by 3,500 people. 25 years before, a photo of St. Paul's rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs had come to symbolize the will and resilience of the British people and of Winston Churchill himself. By tradition, the Queen did not attend the funeral of commoners, but precedent fell by the wayside, and she was there with all the members of the royal family. Churchill's body was carried down the River Thames and then by train to be buried in the small country churchyard at St. Martin's in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, next to his parents. It was within sight of Blenheim Palace, where he had been born 90 years and 2 months before. And so it was that on that cold day in January 1965, the story of Winston Churchill and the royal family came to an end. Today, 57 years later, Elizabeth II still sits on the greatest throne in history. And now, as she, aged 95, lingers in the sunset years of her life, I can't help but imagine that from time to time, she stops to remember the first of her 14 prime ministers, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, who dutifully and nobly served her, 5 other kings and queens, and the royal family for the better part of 9 decades. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lee, for, as always, taking us through a really fascinating history. This a really tumultuous few decades and the very different relationships that Churchill had with successive monarchs. So the audience, you're all very welcome to post questions in the chat to Lee. But I'm going to start off with one question that I've had from Joe Oliver, just picking up on the story that you were ending on, which is Churchill's relationship with our current monarch. And Joe asks, is there any evidence that the Queen consulted Churchill at all in his retirement after 1955?
I'm not aware of anything specific. There were certainly, interactions. I suspect, and Joe, if it's the same Joe Oliver, I would mention that Joe is a PhD student in British history and is the recipient of one of our National Churchill Leadership Center fellowship grants. So we're delighted to be able to support his studies. I'm not aware of any specific cases of that. I suspect Churchill would have been circumspect, given his sense of constitutional propriety of doing anything that might seem to be overtly political or stepping outside the bounds of what a former prime minister should be or doing. Churchill was well in his 80s at this point. There's a tradition in the United States of former presidents not injecting themselves into current politics. That tradition seems to have been bent slightly by the most recent former president, but that's another matter.
Thank you. And I should say I'm receiving lots and lots of messages full of praise and thanking you for an absolutely terrific, fantastic lecture. Another question has come through asking, what is the reason that the British people rejected Churchill's candidacy in 1945?
That's probably one of the most frequently asked questions in the Churchill world. And Americans in particular find this hard to understand. And I tell people it was not a rejection of Churchill's wartime leadership to the extent that there were public opinion polls in those days. He had something like an 80% favorable approval rating, but it was a statement by the British people that they wanted a different kind of society and nation, and one they thought that the Labour Party could provide. The last election had been 10 years before in 1935, and the Conservative Party was still associated in the minds of many people with the old order, the aristocracy, the Depression. And Labour had established itself very credibly during the coalition government during the war, when Clement Attlee was effectively deputy prime minister and somewhat in charge of the home front as Churchill waged war. Things like the Beveridge Report that had come out a couple of years before reflected what the British people wanted. They wanted a social welfare state, and that is what it became. Ironically, as my understanding is that I think General Bill Slim or someone met with Churchill around this time and said, you know, Prime Minister, my men are going to vote overwhelmingly for the Labour Party, and apparently they did. And one of the ironies, I think, is when Churchill returned to office in October 1951, during the rest of his administration, or even when he was succeeded by Anthony Eden and then by Harold Macmillan, the Conservative government didn't reverse the social welfare state in most of the policies that Labour had put in their 6 years. It took Margaret Thatcher to do that, some years later. So that's how I would frame that. Churchill was certainly, surprised if not shocked by this, and momentarily, depressed. He went off to a painting holiday in Italy, which is something painting always cheered him up, and he was determined to return to power. Within less than a year, he was in Fulton, Missouri, making the iconic Iron Curtain speech with President Harry Truman, the leader of the new superpower in the Western world, beside him. So he dusted himself off, as he often did in his life, and went on, and 6 years later was back at number 10.
Thank you. So the questions are coming in thick and fast now, and I should apologize in advance to those of you whose questions we don't get to. We are a very big group tonight, so almost certainly we won't get to everybody's, but we'll try our best. So next question for you, Lee, and that is, can you say a little bit about Churchill's relationship with Edward after his abdication?
Yes, they maintained, I would call it a loose friendship. Edward, and then the Duke of Windsor, was in England occasionally, not very often, and Wallace was rarely there. I think Edward came back in 1952 for his 1953 for his mother, Queen Mary's funeral. The problem that was created was when the Nazis overran Europe in the spring of 1940, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were in Paris, and there's been a whole narrative history about the Germans trying to get hold of them, persuade them to stay, and with the thought that when Germany conquered Britain, which was thought by many people to be a very real possibility, they would create some kind of puppet king, that a role that he would take over. And Churchill was quite anxious to, the Duke of Windsor was under some illusion that he could come back to Britain and have, because he had been the king, could have some important role in the conduct of the war. And that certainly that was not something that Churchill and the government wanted. And they were quite anxious to get him out of Paris. I think he eventually came through Spain to Portugal and then back to England. And Churchill had, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had very disgracefully visited Adolf Hitler in Germany, in Berlin in 1937, were photographed curtsying and giving strong arm salutes. It was a disastrous decision for him to make. And there's certainly many historians who think that the Duke was at the very least sympathetic to Nazi Germany, if not even more than that. So Churchill was quite anxious to bundle him off somewhere, and they ended up appointing him governor of the Bahamas, not something that Wallace found especially glamorous. I suspect in the 1940s, the Bahamas didn't have air conditioning. It must have been rather a hot and muggy place that she wouldn't have liked. And she was, during the 3 or 4 years that they were there, she ran off to New York every chance that she could get. So Churchill made it clear to the king, the former king, that there was no role for him in government, and that he would be well advised to mind his P's and Q's, go off to Nassau, to Government House there, and leave it at that. And there were a couple of times when the Duke, ended up in the US, and the government in London was always concerned that he would go talk to people, say things that would contradict or undermine British policy. So Churchill was very adamant that he had to step back. And then after the war, they had what I call this aimless, wandering, purposeless life, which didn't reflect very well on either of them. Andrew Lowney has a wonderful new book called The Traitor King, and it's quite an expose of the 30 years after 1945, until the king and then Wallace died. It is not a flattering portrayal of them by any means.
Thank you. All right, next in the long list of questions for you. Has Queen Elizabeth ever spoken in retrospect of her relationship with Churchill?
I I think there have been some references, I don't know the specifics. Obviously, he doesn't give interviews where you can ask those questions. Several years ago, we actually had a Churchill Society dinner in London. We were very fortunate to have the Charles, the Prince of Wales, as our speaker. And he recounted when he was 5 years old, I think it was 1953, remembering Churchill coming to Balmoral to visit, as he was still prime minister, coming to visit the Queen. And he had very fond memories, even as a 5-year-old boy, of Churchill being there and how friendly he was to the Queen's children. So I don't know that she is, other than perhaps in some formal settings. Would that she would write a memoir? Wouldn't that be great?
Wouldn't it? Right. What was the value of effective monarchy within a democracy in Churchill's eyes, would you say?
Well, as I said in my talk, Churchill had this very deep sense of British identity and destiny wound up in its history, the great Whig interpretation of British history as a progression of increasing liberty, democracy, and freedom, a beacon to the world, and so forth. And that's one interpretation of British history. And of course, there are others, especially these days. But he regarded the monarchy as an essential pillar of the British Constitution, the British political system. And as some of the quotes that I referenced in my talk, he felt that was one reason that differentiated Britain from the continental powers of Europe, or even to some extent from the United States. How true that is today, and what Churchill would think of that today. We've had this glorious 70-year. It's very fitting that we have this conversation exactly 70 years to the month after the Queen's accession, and hopefully there'll be a wonderful Jubilee celebration in June. The future of the monarchy. I'm a Canadian and still a Canadian citizen, and therefore she is my Queen is the Queen of Canada, as Charles will be at some point in the future. And that's, we'll see how the rest of history played out. I think King Farouk of Egypt was quoted once as saying, and he was obviously deposed himself, and wasn't much of a king. He said, eventually there will only be 5 kings left in the world: the kings of hearts, diamonds, jacks, spades, and England. So he's other than the Scandinavians, he's somewhat right about that.
Well, on the subject of another system, the American system, Alan asks, how would you compare Churchill's relationship with Roosevelt and Eisenhower as president?
Yeah. Churchill's relationship with FDR is something I should have another talk about that. It's called Franklin and Winston, the Friendship That Saved the World. And it was to some degree a friendship. It was a political alliance and partnership. Churchill certainly, from 1940 to December 7, 1941, did everything he possibly could to ingratiate himself with Franklin Roosevelt and with the American government and people, because he knew that Britain might not lose the war by itself, but it certainly couldn't win without the support of the United States. I think Mary Soames, Churchill's daughter, once said that Churchill paid more attention to Franklin Roosevelt than any man would be to his best mistress. So it became a more complicated relationship later on in the war, as the preponderance of American military and political might became more apparent, and Churchill began to realize that if this was a partnership, Britain was the junior partner and would continue to be that. Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, and then Churchill was out of office by July. Had the two of them continued in office, how that relationship might have evolved would have been a different matter. As to Eisenhower, Churchill was certainly an admirer of Ike's, and they obviously had considerable interaction during the war years. Ironically, when Eisenhower won the election in November 1945, Churchill was concerned that this would heat up the Cold War. And in his last couple of years, Churchill was very concerned about the danger of an atomic conflict, with the new hydrogen bomb being so much more destructive than the first atomic bombs had been. And I think at one point he said to someone he was afraid Ike was going to start a nuclear war. Churchill in particular had very little use for John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State for almost his entire 2 terms as president. He once referred to Dulles as a man who a bull who carries his own china shop around with him. So during those last few years, before Churchill retired in 1955, he was concerned about where American Cold War policy would lead. After Churchill left office, they stayed in touch. Churchill came to Washington in 1959, I think visited Ike at the White House. And there was a sentimental attachment between the two of them. Ike took him in a presidential helicopter, and they went up to Pennsylvania from Washington and did an aerial tour of the Gettysburg battlefields. Ike had a farm at Gettysburg, and Churchill was always fascinated by the Civil War. So there was a good relationship, but obviously the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt was the key element in geopolitics of that period of history.
Well, I'll ask one final question, which takes us back to the monarchy. And that is a question from Dr. Christensen, who asks, why do you think George VI was so reluctant to warm to Churchill?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, there was a history of he and the Queen being very close to and very much admiring of Neville Chamberlain. I mentioned the VE Day appearance by Churchill on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in May 1945. If I remember correctly, when Churchill came back from Munich, he was invited to the balcony, I believe, of the palace with the King and Queen. And I think that is a scene that might be in the new Munich Edge of War movie that's just come out within the last couple of weeks, which is an interesting film in itself and something we can talk about some other time. I think that was part of that, the fact that Churchill had been such a vehement supporter of the King's brother, and the Queen in particular was very bitter about. I think she would have preferred their happy family life if he had remained Duke of York. They were wonderful sovereigns and very dutiful during the Second World War, but as I mentioned, she blamed Wallace for disrupting the very nice life that they had and had expected to continue, because the idea of an abdication, the idea of a bachelor king was not entirely impossible or implausible, and perhaps some other more suitable bride might have been found for the king, which didn't happen. But they certainly didn't expect the thought that a king, the king of the greatest empire in the world, would abdicate for a twice divorced American. Was still married, or as I think someone said, a woman with two husbands living. That was certainly a shocking idea. So I think it was a combination of all those things, and also the fact that they were close to Lord Halifax and would have liked him to be the prime minister. So I think it was the combination of those things. But that when they saw what Winston Churchill did and meant to the nation and to Britain's survival, that feeling turned from suspicion to great affection within a matter of months. Shirley, if people have other questions they want to email me, I'm lpollock@winstonchurchill.org. So I'm happy to hear from anyone who has more thoughts about this.
Well, terrific. That's very generous of you. Thank you, Lee. Perhaps we can send out your email address when we out an email tomorrow. And a few of you have asked me in the chat about the recording. We will be sending around the link to the recording in an email to all of you tomorrow. So please do feel free to share that with others who you think may be interested. A big thank you on behalf of everyone to you again, Lee, for taking the time to come and talk with us and for being with us at the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, and for all of your support for the centre. It's very much appreciated. A reminder to all of you to please join our mailing list. And just to tell you a little about our upcoming events, next Thursday, the 3rd of March, we have the author and educator Mike Levy, who's going to be coming and talking with us about Forgotten Heroes of the Kindertransport, which promises to be really excellent. And on Monday, the 14th of March, we have Dr. Bayer Lefkowitz talking about the testimonies of Jewish refugee women in Britain. So both of those should be really excellent talks. Please do register to book your places, and hopefully we'll see you at those talks or some other talks in the future. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you again, Lee. See you all soon.
Thank you.